just for the sake of the argument, imagine that reading and writing is hard. Now, imagine that when reading and writing is hard, you're at school, and school requires you to read and write, to learn by reading. To learn by reading off the board, to learn by reading from books, to learn by writing, copying things down, to do your essays, to hand in your essays. School is a very literacy-heavy environment, and reading and writing is hard. What's going to happen? Well, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to get stressed. You're going to have the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn sort of response. Fawn is when you go, oh, please don't hurt me. You start to get, as it were, you become crushed. You become smaller as a human being. Fight, you might cause problems. You might cause trouble. Remember the famous quotation that 9 times out of 10, when you look at the backstory of somebody who's causing trouble, 9 times out of 10, that story won't make you angry. It'll break your heart. Well, a lot of the time when people are fighting back, they're fighting back against something. This kind of anger, it's not a natural part of kids. It's a response. It's a communication that they're not able to communicate well. So they're fighting, but not because they're bad. They're fighting because they're fighting against something that we are imposing upon them. Another response might be to fly, to flee, to run away, fight, flight. You might think, oh my goodness, I can't do this, I'm not going to. This can take all sorts of forms. It can take forms of school avoidance. It can take the form of refusing to do your homework. It can take the form of just not engaging in class. You're just running away. All sorts of ways of running away. So you might find that if reading and writing is hard, it causes kids to avoid. It causes kids to flee. The fourth of these, of course, is freeze. You just suddenly become unable to do something. You think, I can't respond to this. I went through a lot of this when I was at school. I mean, I had a little bit of the fight, not that much, a little bit of the fawn, but I had the flight. I used to run away, but I'd also freeze. I'd be faced with tasks and I just wouldn't be able to do them. It's not that I chose to run away. I'd look at the homework and I would just go, What might be particularly surprising is that when we get stressed, so when this kind of literacy-heavy environment stresses dyslexic kids out, you might not have realized, but stress reduces your ability to read anyway. So let's imagine that you're finding reading difficult. You're dyslexic, you're finding reading difficult. Your phonological decoding makes it slower, it makes it more tiring, it makes it harder. And that produces stress. And stress then produces this feedback loop. This feedback loop where it makes reading even harder. There is really interesting research to show this. So research by, I think it was Naxon and Harovich-Krauss in about 2020 showed that when you are reading and when you're at school and it can produce stress, this stress impacts upon all sorts of things such as executive function and memory, but it also creates extra problems for reading. So you get these kids between 8 and 12, I think they were studied, and it showed that actually when you stress them out through reading, their reading abilities actually decrease. So what's happening is that you get these dyslexic kids who start off as finding reading difficult. This makes them stressed, and this stress makes the reading even harder. And then you go into this fight, flight, freeze and fawn sort of response. And this again produces stress and it makes the reading even harder. So you have this loop, this feedback loop, as I've said, that we need to be able to deal with. And dealing with it simply by giving kids a little extra time isn't always right. What we need to do is we need to change the structures of the education system so they're not necessarily faced with these things that frighten them in the first place. They're not faced with these things that stress them out in the first place. We need to be able to change the way we educate and accommodate for dyslexic kids. One of the ways of doing that is finding out more about dyslexia, screening kids for dyslexia at a very young age, finding out what dyslexia is and providing teacher training for the teachers. Because without that, we're onto a loser. So to sum up, we find that reading can produce stress. And this stress can make reading even harder. And that can produce more stress. And one of the manifestations of this is that you've got the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. Fighting is playing up and being aggressive and getting expelled or suspended from school. Flight is just refusing. It's refusing to do things. It's not going to class. It's not turning up to school. It's throwing your homework away. Freeze is being unable to look at your homework and just freeze, or to look at what's on the board and think, I can't do this. And fawn is to basically make the person smaller than he or she would normally be. It's an ethical problem. And as an education system, we have to deal with it now.